Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. A good clean water is a very important part of my day-to-day existence. Without water, I can't make coffee. And without coffee, I can't get anything done. Well, first I drink the coffee and then I do the things. My cat's attacking things. Yeah, why drink bad coffee when the Organic Man coffee trike is right there? 4501 McPherson from 6:30 a.m. till 7 p.m. except Sunday. If you discover you're not in Laredo, you can visit Laredo. You can visit organicmancoffeetrike.shop and make your life a better place to live in. Having some technical difficulties this morning, and this is the third try at recording the show, so if I seem a little flustered, that's what's going on. At Tusk 1157 was listening to the show I did about Maria Orsich, and he had heard Rudolph's name being mentioned, and he asked if I would elaborate on the man. I had planned on doing a show about him for the last several years, but I just never got around to it. Well, I got around to it now. I know a lot of folks will say that the world wars are old news. Who cares what happened nearly 80 years ago? There's a lot of mysteries surrounding some of the major players on both sides of the war, or should I say, the three sides. If you want to know why we're where we are today, you have to look at where we come from. The world did not magically become the mess it is in today. Things happened that set the course of our country. It took planning and some deceit to wrangle the world into our current situation. Walter Richard Rudolf Hess was born April 26, 1894, in Alexandria, Egypt. That's 5 years before Adolf made the scene. He was the son of a merchant. Hess served in the German army during World War I. Within weeks of the outbreak of the war to end all wars, Hess enlisted in the 7th Bavarian Field Artillery Regiment. His initial posting was against the British on the Somme. He was present at the First Battle of Ypres. He was involved in some of the bloodiest fighting of the war. Hess was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class and promoted to corporal in April 1915. He served at the Battle of Verdun in May and was hit by shrapnel in the left arm and hand. Hess was promoted to platoon leader, the 10th Company Reserve Infantry Regiment, which was sent to Romania. He was wounded in July and again in August. The second wound was when a bullet entered his upper chest near the armpit and exited near his spinal cord. In October, he was promoted to lieutenant while still convalescing. He requested that he be allowed to train as a pilot, get out of the mud and maybe not get wounded so often. In October, Hess was assigned to the Bavarian Fighter Squadron, which was equipped with Fokker D-7 biplanes, and the following month the war ended. Hess was discharged from the armed forces in December 1918. His family's fortune had taken a serious beating during the war. Their business interests in Egypt had been expropriated by the British. Spoils of war. Hess joined the Thule Society, an anti-Semitic group, as well as a few other groups. At the end of the war to end all wars, the folks in Germany were being blamed for what the politicians had done. Just about everybody was looking for someone who would get the country out of debt. Bavaria witnessed frequent and often bloody conflicts between right-wing and left-wing groups that were fighting to take control of the country. Riots took place on nearly a daily basis. The government unleashed the army to quell these uprisings. Secret police were sent to infiltrate any organization that had more than a few members. Adolf Hitler was one of these secret police. Hess was a participant in many street battles. In 1919, he led groups that were distributing anti Semitic pamphlets. He said that Egypt made him a nationalist, the war made him a socialist, and Munich made him an anti Semite. In 1919, Hess enrolled in the University of Munich, where he studied history and economics. His geopolitical professor was Karl Hasefer, a former general in the German army who was a proponent of the concept of Lebensraum, living space, which Hasefer cited, living space, which Hasefer cited to justify the proposal that Germany should forcefully conquer additional territory in Eastern Europe. Hess later introduced this concept to Adolf Hitler, and it became one of the pillars of Nazi Party ideology. All the land used for farming and manufacturing was taken away from Germany and handed over to other countries as war reprisals. The folks living in Germany were somehow expected to pay for all of that carnage, while at the same time they had no means of making anything to sell. After hearing Adolf Hitler speak for the first time in 1920 in Munich rally, Hess became completely devoted to him. They held a shared belief in the notion that Germany's loss in World War I was caused by a conspiracy of Jews and Bolsheviks rather than military mismanagement. Hess joined the Nazi Party as a member, he was number 16. By November 4th, 1921, he was injured while protecting Hitler when a bomb planted by a Marxist group exploded at the Hofbrau house during a party event. Hess seemed to be an injury magnet. Ilse Prahl met Hess in April 1920 when they rented rooms in the same boarding house. They married in December 1927, and they had one child. Wolf Rudger Hess was born 10 years later. His name was in part to honor Hitler, who often used the name Wolf as a code name. In April 1933, Hess became deputy party leader, and in December, he became a part of the cabinet. 39, Hitler declared him second, only to Hermann Goering in line of succession. Hess was now the number 3 man in all of Germany. Hess had a reputation for absolute loyalty to Hitler. During the late 1930s and the first years of World War II, as military and foreign policies preoccupied Hitler, Hess's power began to wane, and his influence was further undermined by Martin Bormann and other top Nazi leaders. Martin Bormann was Adolf Hitler's secretary, and he was allowed to decide who got to actually speak with Hitler. So if Martin Bormann didn't like you, well, you just didn't get to talk to the boss, even if you were the number 3 man. Hess decided in the spring of 1941 that he was going to bring the military struggle between Germany and Britain to an end by means of a spectacular coup and therefore restore his fledgling prestige. Flagging, not fledgling, flagging. Bit of a sinus infection. On May 10th, 1941, Deputy Fuhrer, the number 3 guy of the Third Reich, embarked on an astonishing flight to Scotland. In one of the most bizarre episodes of World War II, Hitler's deputy flew solo for 1,000 miles from Bavaria to Inglesham in Scotland. Historians say that Hess was on a one-man peace mission in the days leading up to Germany's invasion of Russia. The Messerschmitt Bf 110, which is also known as the Me 110, is a twin-engine heavy fighter bomber and a night fighter. It was developed by Nazi Germany in the 30s, and it was used throughout World War II. It had a maximum range of 680 miles. Hess is supposed to have flown 1,000 miles. In order to pull this off, he would have had to have stopped and refueled. He could have landed anywhere in German territory, any airfield, and gotten what he needed. After all, he was number three. The historians don't say that he stopped and refueled. They just say that he flew 1,000 miles and then he jumped out of his airplane. Swedish newspaper Svenska Dagbladet published a report in May 1941 stating that Hess had not set off from Augsburg or from Germany for that matter, but he started his trip in Calais. Hess had intended on landing near a castle that he had visited before the war. As he flew over the Scottish countryside, he discovered he could not pick out any landmarks. After all, it was the middle of the night. He also found he couldn't find an open place to set down. The terrain beneath him was nothing but darkness. By the time that he was over Scotland, he would have been low on fuel once again. To avoid being killed in a crash, Hess jumped from his plane and parachuted to the ground. He landed hard, injuring his leg. Remember what I said about being an injury magnet? A Scottish farmer found Hess laying next to a tree. Hess identified himself as being Albrecht Hossifer, saying that he was an acquaintance of the Duke of Hamilton. Hess told the farmer that he had vital information for the Duke, and he asked to be taken to him right away. Well, instead, the farmer turned Hess over to the Home Guard, who turned him over to the British military. A doctor was called to come examine Hess's injuries. The doctor found out real quick that this guy's name was Rudolf Hess. Hess was acting very strangely, and none of the soldiers believed this could possibly be the deputy Fuhrer of the Nazi war machine. There was no record of Hess injuring his head. No one ever said he might have been suffering from a concussion or other forms of brain injury. Yet, everyone that talked to Hess said this guy was off his rocker. There was no way that he could be the number three guy in charge. If anything, he might have been the number three guy in charge of sweeping the floor. Hess kept insisting that he needed to speak to the Duke of Hamilton. The Duke had met with Albert Hossifer before the war, and it was Albrecht who suggested that Hess contact the Duke. It would seem that the Duke had been very pro-Nazi before the war. The Duke had also visited Germany in early 1930, and he was impressed by how Adolf Hitler had gotten the German country back on its feet. For reasons of his own, the Duke refused to meet with Hess. Hess had given a false name, Albrecht Hossifer, as if it were some kind of a secret code. He had an important message for the Duke, a fellow aviator whom he had never met. Hess believed that the Duke was part of an anti-government faction and a prominent in opposing the war with Germany. Folks would like us to believe that the world turned out against the Nazis during the war. Not so. There were a lot of British and American citizens that believed Hitler was doing the right thing. A lot of people hated Jews because, well, they were Jewish. When considering his plans for secret peace talks with the British, Hess had sought the advice of his friend Albrecht Hossifer, and Hossifer had suggested the Duke was a suitable contact behind enemy lines. Douglas Hamilton had met Hossifer when he was in Germany as part of a UK parliamentary group that observed the 1936 Summer Olympics, and the two had stayed in touch. The Duke offered hospitality to Hossifer during the pre-war visit to London. This Hossifer link has caused some to speculate that Douglas Hamilton, along with MI5 or MI5 operatives, were actively trying to negotiate peace terms with Germany, and that the Duke approved of Hitler's Nazi regime. And now there's no evidence available to suggest the Duke of Hamilton had sympathy with the Nazi cause and that he was part of any anti government faction. But remember, history is written by the folks still in power when the war is over. I'm sure if there was true, the royals and the historians would tell us. The Soviets began saying that the British military intelligence had induced Hess to make his flight. The Russians began to consider this belief after Stalin had not believed an urgent warning from the British in April 1941 saying that Hitler was about to attack. When the assault began in June, Operation Barbarossa, Stan, Stanley, Sta, Stalin, I'll bet nobody's ever called Stalin Stanley before. Stalin was convinced that Britain was in league with Germany and that Hess's flight had been engineered by British intelligence with the Duke of Hamilton being a go-between. Even after Britain tried its best to bring war supplies to Russia with their Arctic convoys, the suspicion persisted. The Russians could not fathom why Britain did not prosecute Hess as a war criminal, but instead they kept him in comfortable quarters and treated him like a prisoner of war instead of a criminal. By 1991, the KGB declared that the Duke of Hamilton was not directly involved, but that fake letters purporting to be from him had been sent to Hess by MI5 with the intentions of luring him to Britain. This information was supposed to have come from Kim Philby, a British agent and one of the Cambridge Five that were secretly working for the Russian intelligence. Harold Adrian Russell Kim Philby. Does anybody have to have five names? He was a British intelligence officer and a double agent working for the Russian government. 1963, he was revealed to be a member of the Cambridge Five, a spy ring which was divulging British secrets to the Soviets during World War II. A lot of people have been saying that Hess made the flight with Hitler's knowledge and was acting as his emissary. When Hitler finally heard that Hess was in British hands, he wasn't surprised. The folks in the room were surprised when Hitler didn't fly into a rage. Adolf was known to fly off the handle anytime things didn't go his way. You could say he had a really short fuse. His lack of outrage suggests that this was all part of the plan. Hitler didn't hate the British. He just wanted to rule them, just like how the royals were doing. He absolutely despised the Soviets. Anytime you see a picture of Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, Roosevelt is always in the middle. Stalin and Churchill did not get along, and so they always put Roosevelt in between them to keep them from arguing back and forth or trying to punch each other, I guess. Hess himself was adamant that Hitler knew nothing of his intentions. In statements to the British, he said he flew entirely on his own initiative. Setting out on such a dangerous mission, Hess must have been convinced he could not only broker a peace treaty with Britain, but that Hitler would go along with it afterwards. There are just too many clues pointing to Hess having a lot more than just his own initiative before setting out for Scotland. It's just plain crazy to try fighting a two-front war. Hitler and all of his staff would have known this, seeing as it didn't work the first time they tried it. If Britain could be appeased, even if it was just a false treaty like the one with Stalin, it would have allowed the German army to pound Russia into submission without having to keep troops and equipment tied up along the west coast of Europe. Reinhard Heydrich, the hangman, was head of the main Central Security Office, a service which included the Gestapo. Reinhard Tristan Eugene Heydrich, once again, does somebody need so many names, was born March 7th, 1904. Leading up to the war, he became a high ranking German SS and police officer, and he was the principal architect of the Holocaust. Many historians regard Heydrich as one of the darkest figures in the Nazi regime. Of all the nasty, horrible people in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, Heydrich was considered the worst. Adolf Hitler described him as the man with an iron heart. He was the founding head of the Secret Service, an intelligence organization charged with seeking out and neutralizing resistance to the Nazi Party through arrests, torture, deportations, and murder. He was directly responsible for the Einsatz group, and a special task force that traveled in the wake of the German military and murdered more than 2 million people, shooting and gassing them, of which 1.3 million were Jews. The months before Hess flew from the mainland to Scotland, Heydrich was stationed at the Channel defenses, which control both ships and planes coming and going across the channel. It is said that Heydrich had been notified that Hess was going to pass over his position and to not interfere with his plane. There are also stories going around saying that the RAF had been ordered to allow Hess's aircraft to pass unhindered. England had huge radar stations set up along the channel, and they would have seen a plane flying over the coast, especially a single plane by itself way up to the north. There was a heavy air raid on London during the night of May 10th, the same night that Hess was crossing the channel. 520 bombers were sent to destroy London. They dropped 700 tons, including incendiary devices. Among the historic buildings damaged were Westminster Abbey, the British Museum, the House of Parliament, the Law Court, the Public Records Office, and the British Museum. Fires were started on both sides of the Thames, and the number of casualties was somewhere around 1,000 people were killed and 2,000 were injured. If Hess was coordinating his flight with the British, this was a horrible way of doing things. At least that's what most folks would think. Keep in mind, there are people around, both back then and today, who look at those around them as being pawns, nothing else. Bombing missions were planned by underlings who did all the logistics, lining up planes and crews and coordinating fire support and letting the air defenses know not to shoot at the wrong airplanes. Perhaps the bombing raid was already in the works as Hess was taking off. Perhaps it was a part of the cover. Keep all of the Allied fighters occupied shooting at bombers while Hess flew to Scotland. Hess was held as a prisoner of war and taken to the Buchanan Castle, where he was kept for several months. He was transferred briefly to the Tower of London and then to Mychet Place in Surrey, which was a fortified mansion designated Camp Z, where he stayed for the next 13 months. Churchill issued orders that Hess was to be treated quite well, though he was not allowed to read newspapers or listen to the radio. 3 intelligence officers were stationed there, and 150 soldiers were on guard. By early June, Hess was allowed to write to his family. He also sent letters to the Duke of Hamilton, but these were either never delivered or never responded to. Major Frank Foley, the leading German expert in MI5 and former British passport control officer in Berlin, took charge of a year-long interrogation of Hess. Henry Dix and John Rawlings, psychiatrists who treated Hess during this period, noted that while he was not insane, he was mentally unstable. Now, isn't that kind of the same thing? If somebody is unstable, they're considered to be insane, but maybe that's halfway there. Hess had tendencies towards hypochondria and paranoia. Hypochondria is anyone that believes that they're going to get sick or they are sick all the time. Like, say, maybe they catch a cold from listening to a podcast. And paranoia is simply when you think everybody is against you. I'm not paranoid much. I worked for the government. Yes, I'm paranoid. Anyway, Hess told his interrogators that he had discovered a secret force that was controlling the minds of Churchill and other British leaders, filling them with an irrational hatred of Germany. Hess said that this force was also acting on Hitler's mind, causing him to make poor military decisions. He said the Jews had psychic powers that allowed them to control the minds of others, including Himmler, and that the Holocaust was a part of a Jewish plot to defame Germany. In the early hours of June 16, 1942, Hess rushed his guards and attempted suicide by jumping over the railing of a staircase. He fell to the stone floor below, fracturing the femur of his left leg. This is one of the strongest bones in your body, and it has blood vessels and nerves running through it. Fracturing a femur is one of the most painful injuries a person can sustain. The injury required that the leg be kept in traction for 12 weeks, followed by 6 weeks of bed rest before he was permitted to walk again. Captain Monroe Johnson of the Royal Army Medical Corps assessed Hess and noted another suicide attempt was likely to occur in the near future. Hess began to complain of amnesia, even though he didn't bump his head. The symptoms and some of his increasingly erratic behavior may have been just a ruse. If he were declared mentally ill, he could be repatriated under the terms of the Geneva Convention. This could be one more item showing that Hitler knew Hess was taking that flight. If Hess was working on his own and got sent back to Germany, he would have gone from one prison to another, and the second prison would have been a death sentence. Only the if on the other hand Hitler had known that Hess was about to go flying to Scotland, Hess would have been allowed to return to his former station in life, probably greeted as a hero, and he might have gotten that Iron Cross first class that he wanted. Once Hess had recovered from his broken leg, he was moved to Mandiff Court Hospital, where he remained for the next 3 years. The facility was chosen for its added security and the need for fewer guards. Hess was allowed walks on the grounds, and once in a while he was given a car trip around the countryside. He had access to newspapers and other materials. He wrote letters and he wrote in his journal. His mental health remained under the care of Dr. Rees. Hess continued to complain on and off of memory loss and made a second suicide attempt in 1945 when he stabbed himself with a bread knife. The wound was not serious, requiring only a couple of stitches. This led to a starvation ploy that lasted until the guards threatened to force feed him. After that, Hess began to behave himself. Hess, or some guy pretending to be Hess, I'll go into that a little bit towards the end of the show, was a guest of the British military, prisoner is the proper term, until the end of the war. He was then transferred to Germany under heavy security to stand trial for war crimes. When he arrived in Nuremberg, Hess had a collection of food samples that he had squirreled away in his luggage. He was convinced the British military had been poisoning him while he was a prisoner. He was going to use these samples in his defense. Well, all the samples were confiscated and thrown away. An interesting side note, the folks living in Nuremberg back in 1932 did not vote for Hitler to lead the country. They didn't think he was a good choice as president or even dog catcher. Once the shooting had come to an end, the Allies chose Nuremberg because the Nazis had done extensive propagandization in the area in the late 1930s. This was where the Nazi race laws were first announced. It helped in choosing the city when it was looked over and the Allies saw that not only was the Justice Hall still standing, there was a huge prison close by where the criminals could be held awaiting trial. From November 1945 to October 1946, Hess, along with 22 other Nazis, were tried for conspiracy to commit crimes, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, in violation of international law governing warfare. Hess was tried at the Nuremberg war trials, convicted, and given a life sentence. He served his sentence at Spandau Prison in Berlin, where from 1966 on, he was its sole prisoner. The Allied Control Council, or Allied Control Authority, also referred to as the Four Powers, was the governing body of the Allied occupation zone in Germany from 1945 until 1991. The place was controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. If you ever get a chance to watch an old movie called The Third Man with Orson Welles, it's taking place in Austria during this occupation, and it shows just how messed up a lot of the uh, control was. It was like a giant, uh, well, it was a giant mess because you had four countries trying to run things at once. Spandau Prison was built in 1876 on Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. It initially served as a military detention center of the Prussian army. From 1919, it was used for civilian inmates as well. It held about 600 inmates at a time. After the Reichstag fire in 1933, opponents, uh, sorry, opponents of Adolf Hitler were held there. It was formerly operated by the Prussian Ministry of Justice. The Gestapo turned the place into a giant camp of torture and abuse. By the end of 1933, the first Nazi concentration camps were opened. All the surviving prisoners who had been held there in so called protective custody were sent away to these concentration camps. Spandau was placed under the control of the Allied Control Council. Each country supplied prison guards on a monthly rotation. After the inmates were given medical examinations, they were provided with prison garb and assigned numbers by which they would be addressed throughout their stay. Hess was number 7. If any of y'all ever watched the TV show The Prisoner, I am not a number, I am a free man. Uh, his number was 6, so I wonder if that had anything to do with choosing the number. I know Hess was number 7 because there were 7 prisoners. The prison had a small library, and inmates were allowed to file special requests for additional reading material. Writing materials were limited. Each inmate was allowed 4 pieces of paper a month. They were not allowed to speak with one another without permission, and they were expected to work at the facility, keeping it clean and working in the garden. The inmates were taken for outdoor walks around the prison grounds for an hour each day, but they were separated by about 10 yards and they had guards all around them. The Allied powers originally requested the prison in November, expecting it to accommodate 100 or more war criminals. There were 60 or 70 soldiers on duty in and around the prison. There were 60 or 70 professional civilian warders on staff as well. There were 4 prison directors and their deputies and their staff. There were medical officers, cooks, translators, waiters, porters, and other employees needed to keep the place running. Instead of holding 100 or so prisoners, there were 7. This was perceived as a drastic misallocation of resources and became a serious point of contention among the prison directors, politicians from the respective countries, and especially the West Berlin government, who were left to foot the bill for Spandau, while at the same time having to pay for their own prison facilities, which were overcrowded at the time. The debate surrounding the imprisonment of 7 war criminals in such a large space with numerous and expensive complementary staff was only heightened as time went on and prisoners were being released. The British government supported releasing Rudolf Hess as early as 1956. After the release of Speer and Sirach in 1966, the entire facility was being maintained for just 5 prisoners. Various proposals were made to remedy this situation over the years, ranging from moving the prisoners to an appropriately sized wing of another larger prison, releasing them completely. House arrest was considered. By 1969, the prison only held number 7, Rudolf Hess. An entire prison, along with all the staff, maintenance workers, and guards, had 1 prisoner. 1974, Richard Nixon was ready to support a release on humanitarian grounds of prisoner number 7, but his efforts were thwarted by unwavering Soviet opposition. Hitler had escaped to Argentina. Himmler had killed himself after being captured. Hermann Goring had hung himself before the trial. No, wait, no, he took poison. I'm sorry. Adolf Eichmann was also in Argentina. This left only Rudolf to show the world that the Nazis had been defeated. The Nazis never surrendered. It was the German army that surrendered, and the Nazis either kept fighting or ran away and hid. The files show the British government stepped up its efforts to have him freed. In 1979, just after becoming Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington wrote a particularly strong note to the Soviet counterpart, Andrei Gromyko. It would both be inhumane and pointless, he said, to insist that this old man should die in prison. In all, the British made 11 unilateral appeals for Hess to be freed. The Americans and the French supported these in a further 9. The Soviets always refused to consider the release. Nearly 40 years after the end of the war, Soviet politicians and diplomats argued that the release of such a leading figure in the Nazi regime would not be understood by the Soviet people or by others who had suffered. One diplomat said he was not convinced by the so-called humanitarian argument. The suffering which he caused and other Nazis had inflicted was not humane, the man said. A British memo released around the same time said, Hess has shown no remorse and has not renounced his Nazi faith. To release Hess in these circumstances could stimulate a Nazi revival. Hess could be made more comfortable with a radio, a TV, armchair, a rug, things like that, and it was suggested that he get extended visits and almost uncensored mail. Tony Lestier was the last British governor of Spandau, holding the position in the decades leading up to Hess's death. There was also French, American, and Russian governors. They took turns to run the prison for a month at a time. There was an international campaign to free Hess on his 80th birthday was coming up. It included an application to the European Commission of Human Rights by his wife Ilse and a public demand by his son Wolf. As each and every attempt was brought up, it was the US, Britain, and France up against the Soviets. I wonder, were the Soviets that dead set against releasing Hess, or was it because the big three wanted to do one thing and the Soviets didn't want to go along with it? I just got to wondering, how do you suppose things went in school when Wolf was a little kid and it was, what does your dad do for a living? Well, He's the only guy in that prison over there. Hmm. Other memos released told of a few ideas to allow Hess a bit more freedom. He was to be allowed as much time outdoors as he wished in the prison garden. At night, the guards would take his glasses away, so Hess couldn't do much of anything other than sleep. I know when I take my glasses off, I can't get much done. If you can't see, well, Hess died in Spandau in 1987 at the age of 93. The official cause of death was suicide by hanging. Hess was supposed to have tied a light cord over a beam in the garden shed and then stepped off a stool. After his death, Hess was buried in Hunsdale, Bavaria, and his grave later became a pilgrimage site for neo Nazis. In 2011, it was decided that his body should be moved. Hess's remains were subsequently cremated and his ashes were scattered on an unidentified lake. Several witnesses that were in Spandau at the time of Hess's death said that around the time that he was supposed to be killing himself, they saw several military looking men walking away from the shed where his body was later found. None of these men ever came forward to say, hey, number seven just killed himself. The witness also couldn't say that any of these men were actually assigned to work at the prison. Once prisoner 7 was dead, a DNA test was carried out by Austrian scientists. Their test showed the man imprisoned in Berlin's Spandau prison had indeed been Hitler's deputy. However, I'm not convinced the test was properly done. If you ever heard of Ann Anderson, the woman who said that she was Anastasia, the last daughter of the Tsar Nicholas, there was so much evidence that she was telling the truth. She looked like Anastasia. She knew things about the family only a close member would have known. She was visited by cousins and close family friends who all swore that she was the lost Romanov daughter. When the Soviet army went to collect the bodies of the Romanov family, they could only find 5 of them. The Romanovs had a ton of money scattered all over the world. There were family members who, had Ann Anderson been the daughter of the Tsar, well, she would stand to inherit everything. The other members of the family would wind up having to go looking for jobs or something. Would this be sufficient grounds to fake a DNA test, maybe? So people were claiming that Rudolf Hess had been killed in Germany and he had been replaced by an imposter. When the DNA test was done, the scientists said, "Oh, look, yep, it's the DNA. It's the same." I wonder, was it the same? Too many times, people with bad intentions have been allowed to sway facts and figures to their own benefit. Just look at what's been going on for the past several years or decades, for that matter. Who can we listen to and believe? If those people would just stop lying all the time, well, maybe we would believe them once in a while, but unfortunately, the truth just doesn't seem to ever come out. Previously, unseen notes of an army psychiatrist revealed how the British tried to get inside the minds of the Germans' deputy Fuhrer during World War II in an attempt to get inside the minds of the Nazis. If they could figure out how Hitler was thinking, they could outguess what he was about to do. Dr. Henry Dix arrived at MI5's safe house in Surrey in June of 41. He was there to examine Hess. The doctor was led upstairs to the first floor. In Britain, the first floor is the first floor up. You've got the ground floor, the first floor, the second floor is what we call the third. In the United States, the first floor is the ground floor, the second floor is the second. I don't know why we got to be different, but so he was taken upstairs to the first floor. Now I've lost my place. Dix hoped to glean useful insight into what was seen as the collective madness of the Nazi leadership. Anytime Hess had appeared in any media, he had looked square jawed and strong, looked like John Wayne or Chuck Norris. Nah, he didn't look anything like either of those two. But he looked tough. He looked strong. He looked like a leader. He was always seen side by side with Adolf Hitler. In the flesh, that illusion was shattered. The doctor said, "The first impression is undoubtedly of a schizophrenic psychopath. Compared to the photos in the press, the face is that of some tormented beast. The face is bestial, ape, or wolf, that was at one time or might have been quite charming as a youth." That's a weird way to talk, but that's how he said it. Dix was surprised to learn of Hess and Hitler's admiration of the English, despite Germany having the upper hand in the war at the time. He said, "I believe they're trying to frighten us, but are themselves frightened of us. They have always envied us and aped us in their life forms, dress, correctness, etc. They are at least in part ambivalently in love with us. We are we are that elusive superior race they so frantically want to be themselves." I guess instead of the Aryan race, they wanted to be the British race. Dix thought an affection for the British may have been why Hess chose to make his solo flight to Scotland in what he said was a peace mission. Hitler said he had no knowledge of what Hess was trying to do, and the Nazi Party soon declared him to be insane. Was this true, or was this just spin being put out by Albert Speer, the head of the Nazi propaganda? Some historians believe that Hess was seeking to implement the Fuhrer's wish to make a deal with the British so the Germans, who were about to invade Russia, wouldn't have to fight a two-front war. Following his arrival in Scotland, Hess was furious he was being kept as a prisoner instead of being treated as a peace envoy. He had demanded to meet a senior British official, and eventually the government decided to play along, sending the Lord Chancellor John Simon in June of 41. Dix recorded Hess's intense anxiety prior to the meeting and attributed it to his unconscious feeling of inferiority around the British. After Lord Simon had rejected Hess's proposals, Dick worried that his patient would spiral out of control, and apparently his fears were true. That's when Hess tried to commit suicide. Days later, Hess demanded to see Dix in the early hours of the morning and then rushed towards him, jumping over the banister, breaking his leg, according to his psychiatrist. Hess survived, and his erratic behavior continued to fascinate his British captors. A dog-like devotion to Hitler is why Hess is thought to have been given such a senior position in the Nazi Party. Dix and his fellow psychiatrists wanted to form a strategy to denazify the German population. A re-education was one idea that Dix touched on in his final note before handing Hess's case over to his colleague in July. From his statements to various officers recorded in reports by intelligence officer Major Foley, it seems clear that his unconscious admiration of England is now coming more to the surface. This should be attributed to the wise decision to permit him access to English news and certain periodicals as a basis for educative talks with Major Foley and other officers. This education has had a great deal to do with the disappearance of his delusions. Dick's belief that he would reason with Hess to try to liberate him from Hitler's obsession was an optimistic view for the time, but it wasn't working. The commonly held view among scholars was that there was little hope for the future because the German mind was unilaterally authoritarian, paranoid, and militaristic. Not just Hitler, not just the Nazis, but the entire German country. Dix used his experience with Hess as well as German prisoners of war in Britain to say that what he'd learned in these episodes can be directly applied to the problem of denazifying Germans and also selecting suitable candidates for important jobs in the new German administration. British doctors wanted to understand the bigger picture of how to address fanatical Nazis' unconscious adoration of authority. Dr. Dix said, speaking of Hess, he was pathetic and pitiful rather than menacing or unpleasant. We who surrounded him always felt that this was a very insecure man who had been greatly damaged somehow in his early life, and if only better means had existed, if only he hadn't been such an important prisoner of state, we might have done more for him. As time drags on, more and more information either leaks out or is put out to guide our thinking in one direction or another. One such line of thought goes like this: King George IV's younger brother was the central figure in a failed Anglo German conspiracy to topple Winston Churchill and make peace with the Nazis. In order to get things going, a group of royals and their underlings arranged for Rudolf Hess to travel to Scotland where they would hammer out the details of a German British treaty. Once the treaty had been finalized, the royals would go after Churchill and see to it that he was removed from office. At the same time, the German troops could be moved from the Channel defenses and utilized against the Soviets. Churchill famously vowed to never surrender. The prince and his circle feared that British royalty could only be saved from the clutches of the Gestapo by signing a treaty with the Fuhrer. If Germany invaded England, the fighting would create chaos and the royals just might have to run for their lives. A wartime truce would also protect the royal family and the aristocracy from being killed or imprisoned under German rule. Churchill, who had the support of the nation and its military, stood in the way of any potential peace negotiations. The prince and his co-conspirators planned to seize power by calling upon the king to depose Churchill using his reserve powers, which were rarely used, that enabled a monarch to dismiss a prime minister and their government without popular approval. In a parliamentary or semi-presidential system of government, a reserve power, also known as discretionary power, is a power that may be exercised by the head of state without the approval of another branch or part of the government. There was a 30,000 strong army of Poles in Scotland in 1941. They had fled their homeland and they were based there awaiting whatever direction the wind would blow in the war, so they would know how best to be utilized. Poland had had a king and a house of elected officials. Their form of government was very similar to what you would find in Britain. The idea was the Polish military would follow the orders of a king. Their commanding officers would either fall in line or suffer the consequences. It has been said that during World War II, Trenchard Bornius worked as a spy for the British government and was instrumental in enticing Rudolf Hess to fly to Britain. Karl Tankard Bornius was a Finnish art historian working in England who became the first professor of the history of art at the University College in London. Bornius also served as a diplomat liaising between Finland and Britain, and he worked as a spy for the British MI5. Hitler had nothing to lose. If the plan worked, Germany would have the UK as an ally in his planned invasion of Russia. If it didn't work, Hitler would continue with his plan to land troops on the south coast and conquer Britain at his leisure once Russia was beaten. Despite months of planning, the conspiracy failed when Hess discovered he couldn't find the castle where he was supposed to land, and he was forced to bail out. Once on the ground, instead of finding those working for the prince, he was apprehended by the Home Guard, who turned him over to the military. The real reason for the Hess flight has been a mystery for as long as I've been reading books about World War II. It is a real possibility one of two reasons were in play the day that he took off 1941. Either it was an elaborate lure by the British to buy time, or it was a genuine attempt by a small group of aristocrats conspirators to stage a coup against the British. The aristocracy had the most to lose if Churchill was allowed to stay in power. Germany was bombing Britain nightly, softening the country up prior to an invasion, which would surely cost the royals their wealth, their status, and possibly their lives. They were also unhappy that Churchill's strategy revolved around the U.S. alliance, which many saw as the end of the British Empire. A peace treaty with Germany, a country that had a historic tie to the royal family, would have seemed like the most sensible option to them. Communism was the real enemy, particularly to those with much to lose. After all, the British royal family were Germans. Their last name was originally Mountbatten, but during World War II they changed it so that it wouldn't sound so German. But yeah, the royal family in Germany was uh, the royal family in England, Britain, was German. Together, Britain and Germany would have a military might that could crush Russia and their most hated enemy, and to stomp out communism once and for good. The top secret cabal, including MI5 deputy head Claude Danzig, swore allegiance to the royal family, who would almost certainly be dethroned in the event of a German invasion. Ladislaw Sikorski, the Polish military and political leader, is said to have been involved in this plot as well. The takeover would have been further supported by the might of the fierce Polish army. Sikorski was Prince George's next door neighbor in the Berkshires, and he was a close friend of the royal family. Churchill was aware that his position was under threat, though he did not know the full details of the coup or of MI5's involvement. Prince George, a serving member of the RAF, is believed to have been in Scotland on the day that Hess landed, and he was a friend of Douglas Hamilton, the 14th Duke of Hamilton, whom Hess was demanding to see. General Sikorski ended a fundraising trip in the United States to fly back to Prestwick, near Glasgow, the very next day, putting his life at risk by commandeering a new type of plane that was fast, but it was notoriously difficult to control. It looked like he was more concerned with getting there on time than in one piece. Hugh Thomas, a former army surgeon, had a theory that an impostor flew to Britain on May 10th, 1941, and that the real Hess had been murdered back in Germany. Thomas had visited Hess in Spandau prison in September of 73, but he didn't notice evidence of Hess having any bullet wounds or all of the different injuries that he had received while fighting in World War I. Why Hess would need to be replaced? Who knows? Maybe uh, Hermann Goering wanted to get rid of the number three guy. It could be that he was afraid that Hess might dethrone him and take his position away. After all, Goering, he had some issues far worse than anything that Hess ever had. I might have to do a show about him someday. There's enough evidence to support this theory. Then again, the official record says that Hess was the man who was found in that field in Scotland. The government would never do anything like forge documents or lie to its citizens. Now comes the hard part. What do you think Hess flew to Scotland, and did Hitler know that he was going? There's a ton of proof out there that says that Hess was simply crazy and he wanted to stop the war at any cost. Hess had been wounded a number of times during World War I. He kept going back and he even tried to become a fighter pilot. So the guy wasn't afraid of fighting. That theory that he was a peacenik just doesn't hold any water. A lot of Europeans were taking all kinds of drugs back in the 30s. There were all kinds of new and interesting drugs coming out on a daily basis. People actually believed in better living through chemical dependency, kind of like today. Could Hess have burned his brain out taking substances, trying to make himself think better, and simply wound up going nuts? Unfortunately, we may never know the truth. Every time somebody comes out with a definitive book about the subject, any title, any book title that says the last word in it, you can pretty much figure that that's nonsense. Jack the Ripper, the last word. Roswell, the last word. Every time they do that, it's like, no. Until we actually get some proof of whether or not Rudolf Hess was the man in Scotland, whether or not Adolf Hitler knew that he was going, whether or not the royals in England were planning to get rid of Churchill. I'm afraid we'll never know the truth until perhaps when we die and supposedly we get to know everything. I don't know if my brain can handle knowing everything, but that's what they say. Of course, people also say other things. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, I'm going to borrow something from Tony Merkel and say, share the show. I don't care who you share it with or how you share it. Share it, pass it around, let other people know what I'm talking about. Unless you think I don't know what I'm talking about, then nobody wants to hear from you. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things, and don't forget about the baby flies.